All right, looks like my video is recording. All right, so just to let you know, today our subject is Europe, new ideas and new nations. And this class is scheduled for August the 23rd, 2021. Okay, I hope everybody's doing well with the new mandates and what have you, and we can avoid some lockdowns and just stay healthy. It's very important. Wear your mask and get your shots when you need to get your shots. Okay. I already have one of my shots and I'm scheduled to have a second one. So stay safe. All right. So let me go to the material. Today I'm going to cover a lot of different, we're in Europe. So it's going to be Germany, France, Italy, Austria, you name it. So it's going to be a lot of places. All right. My usual routine, go to the material. Okay, let me minimize myself, take myself out of the picture. All right. Go from the beginning. Okay, next page, World Civilizations 2. Okay, if you need to know, it's going to be week 8, but again, it's scheduled for August the 3rd. All right, now onto the material. I have a pretty big sidebar there, but like I said, I usually do it after. So hopefully no visits from the ghost today. Everything would be okay. Like I said, Europe, new ideas and new nations. Basically, that's just a break from the old kings and queens and most people not having a lot of rights to switching to giving more people rights and power, right? So here we go. The ancient, which means very, very old. You can be old, but ancient is older than that. Regime, and that means a regime is a style of power, can be a communist regime, can be a dictatorship, name it. So kings and queens. The ancient regime of pre-1789 Europe could not be brought back, right? It could not. Too many changes had gone through. In countries other than France, many of the political, legal, and social reforms that the French Revolution had brought or attempted to bring were delayed or even temporarily reversed. In France, however, the changes since 1789 were too popular to be ignored. And the forces unleashed or let go by the Industrial Revolution in England were going to remake the society of Western Europe by the mid-19th century. The throne shaking, who sits on the throne? The king and queen. Revolts, which means revolutions, of 1848 were the direct result of the changes set in motion by industrialization. And if you don't remember what that is, that's when modern machines come into play to change the workforce from mainly farming. So changes were set in motion by industrialization and by the ideas of 1789. So just reading the sidebar. And again, you don't have to worry about this information. I'm going to move my name from down here because it's in the way of the last sidebar. Okay, 1815 to 1850, economic liberalism, conservatism, nationalism, and socialism emerge, which means come forth. They were not discussed and put into place before this time. 1830, July Revolution in France. Louis Philippe, 1830 to 1848. 1832, Reform Act in Great Britain. 1848, popular revolts in France. Austria, Prussia, and Italy. Like I said, I'll be many places discussing. 1849 to 1850, failure of revolts, conservatives regain control. So you will see it's a back and forth fight. 1851 to 1871, Louis Napoleon III, Second Empire of France. 1853 to 1856, Crimean War. 1859 to 1870, Unification of Italy. 1861, freeing of serfs in Russia. And serfs were comparable to slaves. They were owned by certain royalties and worked like dogs and didn't have the ability to own property or make money to survive. They were just taken care of. That's why the similarity. Civil War in the United States, but again, we have to cover Europe. We're not dealing with the US in this week. 1862 to 1871, Unification of Germany. 1870, Franco-Prussian War. Okay, moving on. After the defeats of 1848, European liberals, nationalists were in retreat during the next decade, which means 10 years. And conservative statesmen were everywhere in control. But only 20 to 30 years later, many of the goals of the liberals had been reached, and nationalism was already one of the givens of policy making. The universal mail franchise was introduced in several countries. Governments in many places legalized the labor unions, and Russia freed its serfs. So no more slave-like labor. The Western world was entering the second industrial revolution, and the massive social changes that accompanied it or came with it. So now we move on to liberalism in politics and economics. Much of the history of the past 2 centuries, especially in Europe, has been a reflection of sustained or continued revolutionary changes in politics and economics. The political revolution was highlighted by events in the United States between 1775 and 1789, and in France between 1789 and 1800, which we looked at in earlier chapters. The economic revolution was slower and less spectacular, but it was at least unimportant over the long run. It was generated by changes in industrial production that took place beginning in the second half of the 18th century, particularly in Britain, by the conquest of space through the railroads. So they're not meaning space in the sky, but land space. And by the immense growth of population in Europe and the United States. As is often the case, changes in one sphere or one circle reinforce changes in the other in all kinds of ways. 2 examples will suffice or will do, right? One, in the 1790s, during the period of the Directory in France, a tiny group of conspirators tried to eliminate property-based distinctions, and their efforts at sharing equally the products of human labor got nowhere. A generation later, another group of theorists was determined to replace the abuses and exploitation of early capitalism with the humane ideas of equality and mutual care. This was the origin of an organized multinational effort to introduce governmental responsibility for the welfare of the citizenry. So before with the kingdoms, they were going to tell you, we're not responsible for taking care of the citizens. The middle classes guided the 8th century political revolution on their own behalf. Later, the more perceptive among them recognized that without the active assistance of much of the laboring classes, they could not gain and hold power against the aristocracy, which is the royalty, high society. The industrial laboring classes were growing rapidly, but lacked leadership from within their own ranks. Instead, during the later 19th century, a partnership grew up in Western Europe between the middle class reformers and newly franchised working class voters, which brought about substantial improvement in the condition of ordinary people. The liberal sons and daughters of the Enlightenment everywhere formed a party of reform dedicated to changing the traditional class-based system of political representation. By 1850, much had been achieved in those respects in America and France, but the conservative reaction nullified some of those gains everywhere in Europe. Only in France and England was much of the liberal political agenda retained or kept. Parliaments, which are the governments, like a Congress, similar to Congress, in both countries, similar to Congress in the United States, were responsible to the voters rather than to the king, and freedom of conscience was guaranteed. So you could think what you want, but before you better agree with what the king says, bad or good. Right, so you know that I finished that. Before I start the gospel of free enterprise, I got a couple of questions for you. So it's my first trip to the whiteboard today. Question one. I should start with a capital, okay? Long question, short answer. Well, at least shorter than my question. All right, let me see how much I can stretch this. Can I make it a Tuesday? Okay, cool. The history of the past 2 centuries in Europe have been a reflection of what? So again, if I get some students says, why do you ask these questions with these high level words? What does it mean has been a reflection of what? I'm using this because it's directly connected to the answer. So if you find this, you'll find the answer. That's why. It's a help to you. And 2. Again, let me check. Make sure I ask this correctly. All right. You guys think I can make this a onesie? Let me try my skill. Onesie, please. Yay. All right, question 2. The party of reform was dedicated to what? And that's one of the last parts that I read, so it should be easy to find. So let me give you a few minutes to do that. Okay, you guys doing okay on that? Hope so. I guess I'll go for the eraser. Where's that thing? All right. Repeating the history of the past 2 centuries in Europe have been a reflection of what? Use this to find your answer. 2, Party of Reform, which was a special party at the time, was dedicated to what? Same thing for this. Those 2 questions are out of the way. So here we go. So we're starting here. We ended here, was guaranteed. The gospel of free enterprise, which, enterprise means business. Another side of the liberal philosophy focused on freedoms in the marketplace and rebellion against the traditional restrictions imposed by mercantilism. Economic liberalism grew directly from the path-breaking work of Adam Smith, whose ideas were mentioned briefly in chapter 32. What did Smith's adherents want? It's another way of saying followers. They wanted laissez-faire, that's a French term. If government would only let them alone to do what they saw best fit, which is laissez-faire, not the government telling you how to run your business, right? Like in a communist country. The merchants and the manufacturers of every nation would produce goods and services to meet the demands of the market most efficiently and economically. So that means if the people in your market, they want, most people want a lot of kimchi, then that's what you'll start making, right? And you can price everything accordingly, right? To the amount of the demand. Okay, they also wanted free trade. The existing mercantile system of quotas, licenses, and subsidies should be eliminated. And producers should be allowed to trade with any place and anyone at prices, again, that the free market was set. So again, they're telling you, you can't trade prior. With this person, you can't trade with that company. We're going to give you a tax. Here, it's all about free trade. Next, the less government, the better. As the first 2 conditions suggest, the economic liberals despised or hated governmental controls of any sort in the economy, even though Smith made certain important exceptions to laissez-faire. They believed that the free market alone would provide proper guidance, right? Show you the way for policy decisions. So in the early 19th century England, extreme laissez-faire, fairism, often called Manchester liberalism, because of its popularity with the cotton mill owners in Manchester, the city in England, provided the employers of industrial labor with an excuse for the systematic exploitation of the weak. Using theorists such as Thomas Malthus, David Ricardo, and such, the Manchester liberals believed that the poor would always be poor because of their excessive birth rate, so too many poor people are being born, and other supposed moral faults. It's interesting, I don't know how it's anybody's fault to be moral, but people, if you notice now, like in Hollywood and what have you, some couples don't want to have a kid or they want to have one and say, well, there's, we're overpopulated, so morally I should not have a kid like that. But then you get people from poorer countries, and possibly because of their religion, they'll have many, many children. That's the last thing they care about, right? And that it was the well-off people's duty to protect their material advantages by any means they could. Because sympathizers with this line of thought, the Whigs came into control of the British House of Commons after Electoral Reform Act of 1832. The British government grew unsympathetic toward the idea of social protection of the lower classes. So that means the British government had a stronger feeling of, we don't really care about protecting these social protection rights of the lower people. Only in the 1870s and later did a sufficient number of reformers emerge who rejected this heartless attitude and busied themselves with the improvement of the lot or the situation. The British people say lot. Situation of the poor majority. Okay, so before I move on to conservatism, it's question time. Should I have one or two? Be a cruel speaker? Let me see, or just have one. I guess I'll just have one. Like, or question 3. So pretty straightforward, pretty easy. Yeah, I can make this a onesie. What do the Manchester Liberals believe? So have at it. We just read that. That shouldn't take you a long time there. All right, I'll go for the eraser. Repeating, what do the Manchester Liberals believe? Remember, this is a city in England, not far from London. All right, that's done. Back to the new share. Material. This is where we ended. We're going to start with conservatism now. The liberals, though gaining strength, were by no means the sole or only players in the European political field after 1815. Supported by the wave of anti-Napoleonic, so Napoleon, remember from France, nationalism, conservative forces in Britain and France were powerful for at least a generation, and elsewhere even longer. Conservatism in the first half of the 19th century meant one of two things. One was moderate conservatism, the other was reaction. So even though it's a very small reading there, I have a question because conservatism is important to know and discuss. So one question here. It should be question 4. Okay, I should be able to make this a Tuesday. Can I slide the number in there? Yay, 4. Okay, so question 4, conservatism in the first half of the 19th century meant what? So give me the definition or meaning of this. Okay. All right, that should be enough time. Let me grab the eraser. Repeating conservatism in the first half of the 19th century meant what? Okie dokie. Back to a new share. Material. Now we're going to go into moderate conservatism. Conservatives of all stripes, which means all the different styles of conservative, doesn't mean that they actually had stripes, believe that an official religion was a necessity for instilling or making proper respect for law and tradition. So what they're saying there is, which is kind of a conflict we're having now, in the United States, where we have had all these things instilled with God, like you'll see it on our money. They're still in most governmental buildings, in God we trust, and other type of Christian slogans. But here, and so here we're talking about how people felt, hey, you need to have a faith to really know what it is to be moral and respect law and tradition. But now we have a lot of people that are like, I don't believe in any God. That doesn't mean that I can't be a moral person, right? So they're fighting even this back then. They could not imagine a state in which church and government were separated by law. This is even stronger because we have separation of church and state here, but here it's like you got to have the religion. So in a sense, it's kind of like Islam, right? I'm sure you've just noticed the Taliban taking over Afghanistan. They don't separate law from Islam. Their law comes from their Quran, which is the equivalent of a Bible. So Christians were kind of thinking this way here in Europe at this time with Christianity. They supported a constitution, but rejected political democracy, which is what we have here in the United States, as being the rule of the mob. Mob is a group of people with guns, knives, weapons, and they don't discuss things and want to know what your point of view is. They just take over and say, well, we're the majority. So they believe that only those who had a stake in society, which means you have a responsibility in society, evidenced by property, could take on the burdens of self-government. Moderate conservatism was supported by a large percentage of ordinary Europeans, probably a majority, who had been appalled or sickened or upset or disgusted by Jacobin radicalism and Napoleon's arrogance. Arrogance is when you have a very high ego. The clergy, which is a religious group, both Catholic and Protestant, were the leaders of moderate conservatism in much of the continent. So that's no surprise. Who was in charge of this movement? The churches of the Catholics and the Protestants. The more enlightened aristocrats, which means more educated high society folks, who could see what would happen if turning the clock back were to be adopted as state policy, also contributed to moderate conservatism. They wished to avoid revolutions in the future by making some necessary concessions now. So concessions mean, well, we'll do this for you if you'll do that for us. We'll concede this for you. In economics, they favored the continuation of government controls in trade, especially foreign trade. So they want to go back to those controls. They don't look, I guess they don't like laissez-faire. And industry. They thought that Smith was well-meaning but wrong, and that without such supervision by the authorities, selfish and greedy entrepreneurs would only harm the national welfare. So again, the example that I can give you here is like the folks that I know that are from Cuba. The government controls everything. They tell you how much you can sell, and how much your salary is, and how much you can eat, and all these things. And it's usually very, very low. Okay, so there is no laissez-faire. There is no what the market demands, we adjust. That's why doctors here can get rich, and because of the free market, they can charge what they want. If they charge too much, they won't get any patients, right? And in Cuba, they're poor. Very, very, a man's a doctor and he's poor. I just don't understand that. But so they're like, we got to go back to the controls because the government knows best, you know, because you'll get greedy people and they'll take advantage of everybody, right? All right. So that says reaction. So again, even though I did a small part in moderate conservatism, I have one question. All right, that's a new share. It's getting a little cool here. I'm going to turn off my aircon. Righty then. Oh, don't make those sounds. Yeah, that was not my stomach. Okay, question 5. Okay, I should be able to make this a onesie. All right. So it says modern conservatism of all stripes believed what? Again, if you were not paying attention earlier, I translated all stripes means all styles. There's different styles of moderate conservatism. Believed what? Now I could have put styles to make it easier for you to understand the question, but I'm using stripes because when you find the word stripes, it's like it is in the answer. So you'll find the answer, okay? So go ahead. Okay, you think you got a hold on that? Hope so. Okay. All right, should I go for the eraser? All right. So repeating, modern conservatism of all stripes or styles believed what? All right, back to the new share. Now we're on to reaction. All right. Reactive conservatism was the rule in Prussia, Austria, and Russia, where few, if any, political concessions were made to the social structures being created by the changing modes of production. This led to explosive pressures, which eventually burst forth in the revolts of 1848 and the upheaval of World War I and its revolutionary aftermath, which means the revolutions that came after. In Prussia and Austria, the reactionary conservatives ruled for a generation after 1815. They denied a constitution. So a constitution usually helps the lower class of people. Retain the established church. So established church is going to have power, whether Catholic or Protestant, and maintain strict class distinctions and justice, taxation, and voting rights. Not good. I mean, some high-level people had better voting rights and less taxation, etc. Both countries also maintained a form of serfdom until 1848, which again is a kind of like a legalized slavery. Russia, which meant not only the Russian ethnic groups, people who are not technically Russian, but of a different group. Like you have this in China. You look at the person and you say, are you Chinese? And they're saying no. The majority of the people in China are Han Chinese, but they might be of another ethnic group, which has a different language and cuisine and culture. But also much of what is now independent Eastern Europe. The reactionaries were also in command. Tsar Alexander's successor, Nicholas I, he ruled from 1825 to 1855, was a sincere believer in God's designation of autocracy. So where's that arrow? In Russia, and a dyed-in-the-wool reactionary. When you're dyed in the wool means you can't get the stain out. So you won't change your mind. If I tell you something like, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Mexican food lover, I'll never stop eating Mexican food for most of what I eat. Maybe I'll have a pizza and I don't know, teriyaki once in a while, but man, I gotta have my Mexican food every day, probably. During his reign or his kingdom, Russia was called the gendarme of Europe, eager and ready to send troops to put down liberal agitation or revolutionary change wherever it might rear its ugly head. All of Europe was split during the entire post-Napoleonic generation between these reactionary forces and liberal opponents. Okay. So we've read this. Again, if you reread your stuff, reread your stuff. So I'm going to do this like this. This is going to be different, okay? Because sometimes I get lazy students, right? I've even heard of students that they have someone else watch the video. They don't even watch it and answer the questions for them. And then most of the questions I reuse, but I always tell you, you have a responsibility to read your material and to know what's covered. So if I would always give you the same questions from the homework, then that's kind of cheating. I do give you most, so I want you to do well, but I might throw in a new question and if you never read. So I'm going to do this like this for the first time. Today, I don't have, and again, I'll do it like this. Okay. All right. So you see, I've just read reaction. Okay. And it goes to here. So I'll do it like this. Today, I will not give you a question here because that would give us 1 over the limit. And I usually stop at 10. Sometimes if there's a lot of material in depth, I'll only give you 9, but I usually give you 10 questions. So I'm not going to give you a question from reaction today, but I'm giving you a warning. A question from this reading might show up on the final. Okay, so if you have your friend watching the video and you're going to give them, you know, a hamburger, a McDonald's set, and you have them answer the questions for you, you better make sure this person tells you, hey, you better watch this at least one time because he's going to pull a question out of reaction. Okay. So I'm even giving you a heads up, which I've never done before. I mean, you do have a responsibility to do your homework, so, and not pay somebody else to do it or have your boyfriend do it for you. Okay, so now we'll move on to nationalism. All right. So up there. Besides the struggle between liberal and conservative, another source of conflict appeared in the post-1815 Europe. Popular nationalist feeling. Modern political nationalism has its origins in France between 1792 and 1795, 3 years, when the Jacobins insisted on the duties imposed or forced on all citizens by patriotism. Later, when the French occupied half of Europe, their subjects' patriotic reaction against the occupier contributed mightily, strongly, to the growth of nationalism elsewhere. So when France, through Napoleon, occupied all these other countries in Europe and talking about French nationalism, this helped grow the nationalism of these other smaller, weaker countries. They learn, we got to get the French people the hell out of here because we should be the ones who are strong in our own country, right? All right, so as you see, which I'll show you. Okay, so that moves. So just here, I have a question. It's about time, right? You're going to escape forever. And this will be question 6. So we're more than halfway through. So we're moving along steadily. Let me read this correctly. Okay. Okay, let me try to make this a onesie. It might be tough. Good deal. I give myself an applause. Yay. Okay, what had its origins in France between 1792 and 1795? Gotta be careful. I don't want to write 1975. All right, I just read this, so it should be easy to find. So go at it. Find your answer. All right, you're doing okay there? Hope so. All right. Let me get the eraser. Right. What had its origins or beginnings in France between 1792 and 1795? Okay, gone. New share. Back to the material. So we did nationalism. Now we move on to liberal states, France and Britain. So like I told you before, we're all over the place, different countries. In an almost bloodless revolution, which means almost nobody died, was killed in July 1830. The French threw out their unpopular Bourbon, that's the Bourbon House ruler. Has nothing to do with alcohol. In his place came Louis Philippe, ruling from 1830 to 1848. Again, you don't have to remember these dates. Just like in the last question, I gave you the dates. I didn't ask you for the dates. Louis gladly accepted from Parliament a moderately liberal constitution, which stated that sovereignty lay in the people, not in the throne. So what that means is power and rule was really in the hands of the citizens, not in the king. The July monarchy, the 18 years of Louis Philippe's reign, were a major step forward for liberalism. Citizen rights were granted and usually observed by the government, but those rights were much more extensive for the well-off than for the majority. So again, that repeats. It's much better for the rich people. Social tensions were strictly building. Victor Hugo's great novel, Les Miserables, is the best mirror of this epoch. So it's the best way to view this time frame. Or the protests of the Conservative Party, the Tories in 1832, the Liberals in the British Parliament, the Whigs, passed the most important reform of voting rights since the Glorious Revolution. This Reform Act of 1832 stripped away or took away many of the traditional political advantages of the landholding aristocrats and strengthened the previously weak urban middle classes. Overnight, the House of Commons seats were distributed to urban and industrial districts. Because the Whigs controlled these districts, the composition of the Commons changed drastically. By making Parliament into a more representative national body, British government diminished the danger of revolution. So diminished means lessened. The British middle classes were assured of a parliament in which their voice would be heard and through which they could attain peaceable, orderly change. In the later 19th century, these concessions would be extended to the working classes. Revolution and radical socialism never gained much following among the common folk or people in Britain for that reason. Okay, so I do have a, let me see. Yes, I do have a question in there. Or, oh, I just did 6, right? Yeah. Oh, I haven't done that yet, have I? Oh, excuse me. Getting confused here. Oh, I doubled the number. So that's actually 7. Oh, you still might get an extra question, or maybe I'll throw it out. Okay, so this would be question 7. I'm trying to be as kind as I can. I don't want to be too tough. You know, tough and rough. Should I not forget the pencil? Okay. I think I can manage this into a onesie. Come on, come on. Oh, 1, 2. Very good. The British Parliament Reform Act of 1832 did what? So what did it do? Should be easy to find. Take your time on that. Are you doing okay there? All right, I guess I'll go for the eraser. Repeating question 7, the British Parliament Reform Act of 1832 did what? Okay, I think I need a little water, getting a little sore there. Back to the material. So now we're going to move on to the reactionary states, Austria, Russia, and Prussia. The reactionary states, Austria, Russia, and Prussia. In these reactionary countries, the story was different. In Austria, Prussia, and the Germanies, the rulers spent the generation after Napoleon attempting to hold back all thought of political liberalism. See, one side's one way in some set of countries and one side's the other. Through censorship, police, and military force, this is what they used, and diplomacy, and eventually war, they threw a dam across the tide of reform, which held until 1848. The Austrian emperor, the Russian czar, which is another word for king, it actually means a Caesar, and the Prussian king rejected the kind of concessions the French and British governments had made to their citizens. So they didn't want to give these same nice options to the citizens. As a result, revolt seemed to many thinking people the only hope of bringing these countries into modern political and economic force or economic life, which means, okay, you're going to deny your society these benefits. So after a while, they're probably going to try a revolution against the kings, right? It's only common sense. All right. So that's important stuff. So I do have a question there. Okay. That'll be question 8. read it correctly? So compared to the group that we just read about, same time. Rulers meaning kings. All right, let me see what I can do with this stretchy wise. Can we stretch it to it too? Oh, okay. Barely made it. So at the same time, question 8, Austrian, Russian, and German rulers, kings, spent a generation doing what? So different of the freedoms of the laissez-faire of the other group. So tell me a few things. There's a little list here. So again, the more you tell me, the more points you get. Because if this question comes on the mid or final, you tell me one thing they did versus your classmate who told me 3 or 4, you're not going to get as many points. Right? Oh, go ahead. Guys doing okay making that list? Hope so. All right, I'll go for the eraser. All right, so repeating at the same time, Austrian, Russian, and German rulers, kings, spent a generation doing what? I'll give you a hint. They were negative things, okay? All right. Let me share. Back to the material. Let me move on. Okay, so now we're going to get into Russia. Right? Right. The first severe failure of the international alliances. Alliances is the groups of countries forming like a contract to help each other. Set up by the Vienna treaties was the Crimean War, pronounced Crimean, Crimea River, okay? 1853 to 1856, between Russia on one side and England, France, and Turkey on the other. So again, what a list of countries we're getting into here. Expansionary ambitions led by Tsar Nicholas I. Okay, what that means is he says, hey, I want to expand Russia. It's not big enough, so I have to take these lands. So he demanded Turkish concessions in southeastern Europe. So he's saying, I think Russia used to own these lands before, and somehow they got to Turkey. We want them back. Okay, whether that's true or not, I'm not sure. Once assured of British and French help, the Turks unexpectedly resisted. The conflict or fighting was mostly fought on the Crimean Peninsula and the Black Sea. Militarily, the war was a general debacle or disaster for all concerned. So everybody, it was a bad move for everybody. The Russian commanders and logistics were even less competent than those of the Allies, so they really had bad plannings and strategy. So in time, Russia had to sue for peace. Oh my God, what a mistake. The Peace of Paris of 1856 was a drastic diplomatic defeat for St. Petersburg, which is, I think, the second largest city in Russia. And for the next 20 years, Russia was essentially bottled up in the south, unable to gain naval access to the Mediterranean. So this prevented them from maybe trading in the seas of the Mediterranean. Its pressing internal problems would have to be addressed if it were to play any sizable role in future world affairs. Okay, so again, a small reading with good information. But I'll have a question. And just to let you know, here's a map, right? So here's France right here, Great Britain above them, the island, right? Austria-Hungary, the big, huge Russia, the Turks down here. So it says Europe after 1871, the unification of the Germanies, which we'll get into next, and the Italian peninsula had been completed by 1871, but Southern Europe was still in a political flux or turmoil. Disintegrating Turkey meant that Bosnia would soon fall under Austrian occupation, and a lost war against Russia would force the Ottomans, which are the Turks, to recognize the independence of Serbia, Montenegro, Romania, and Bulgaria in 1878. In 1912, a new war allowed the Kingdom of Albania to emerge from the Ottoman Empire, while Greece and Serbia were enlarged. The countries got bigger. Okay. So a little bit of reading here. They had military, the war was a general debacle. Okay, so I read this, right? All right, so a question on Russia. And so this is I didn't correct that. Oh, I already had question 8, so this is 9s, or I have to change it. That means we're getting close to the end. Oops, not gout, font. This is an easy peasy one, lemon squeezy. So again, you see I'm supplying you with the date. Let's see if I can make it a onesie. Try my best. Yes, okay. Who fought each other in the Crimean War in 1853? So have at it. All right, you think you got that? All right, let me go for the eraser. So repeating who fought each other in the Crimean War. So please don't tell me. I think it was Mexico and Brazil. They were fighting each other in the Crimean War. You know, no. Don't be a bad boy. Back to the material. So what happened here? Did I click that too much? No, good deal. All right. So now we move on to the unification of Italy. One of the major changes in the political map of 19th century Europe was the completion of the unification of Italy. Maybe I'll show you a map. This had been the goal of two generations of Italian statesmen and revolutionaries going back to the Napoleonic Wars. In the 1860s, unification was thrust or shoved or forced through the opposition of both Austria, which controlled much of northern Italy, and Pope Pius IX. Father of Italian unification was the liberal-minded aristocrat Count Camillo Cavour, 1810 to 1861. So that's a long time for people at that time, 51 years, who became the prime minister of the Kingdom of Sardinia in 1852. Sardinia had long been the best hope of those who wanted a united Italy. However, the center of political gravity in the kingdom had long since moved from backward Sardinia to Piedmont, and in particular to the progressive and modern industrial city of Turin. So here's a map. Here's Italy. We always describe it as the boot, right? It looks like a big fashionable boot, right? So we don't have to know about the kingdoms of Piedmont and the changes, just to let you know this is Italy and the areas that they're talking about, right? And here's Sardinia down here, what have you. Okay, so realpolitik or politics based on practical considerations only and not ideology, right? Or religion. Cavour built Piedmont into the leading economic force in Italy, as well as a major political power during the 1850s. Cavour fully realized that Austria would never willingly let go of its Italian provinces. Therefore, a foreign ally was needed, friend, and that ally could only be France. Carefully, he drew the all too willing Napoleon III into a so-called, so not really official, defensive alliance, and then provoked a war with Vienna in 1859. The Austrians were outmatched and forfeited the large Lombard province to Cavour, so they had to give it up. They were tricked, and then they weren't strong enough to defend, so they had to give it up. As Cavour had reckoned or thought, after the defeat of Austria, much of the rest of Italy threw in its lot or situation with Piedmont. The newly christened Kingdom of Italy, based in Turin, now embraced about half of the peninsula. The rest was divided among the Pope, the reactionary Bourbon King of Naples, and Sicily, who wished to remain independent, and the remaining Austrian possessions. Okay, so we have to go to a question. Germany will be our last reading. I have one question for Italy, but it looks like I tried to save you, but we might go over one question today. I didn't ask you a question in a certain area and still. Okay. See, I'm writing this long question and you're going to give me one short answer. So you'll like that. Okay, see if I can do a twosie on this. Uh-oh, that's not good. Okay, I guess it's too late. All right, so here's your question. One of the major changes of 19th century Europe was what? What major change? If you go back to the first part of this reading, your answer's right there. So go ahead. Have at it. You think you got that? Okay, eraser. One of the major changes of 19th century Europe was what? Okay, so back to the material, and we'll read about Germany. And if I have one question for you, it'll make it 11. So sorry about that. You won't have more on the final, don't worry. So the unification, again, that's when all the states get together of the Germanys. During the same years that the Italians were attempting to construct one state, came the unification of Germany. The fashion by which Germany was united would have been a dominant influence on the later history of the country. It followed the conservative realpolitik style of two men, the Prussian king William I, or Wilhelm I, ruling 1861 to 1888, and his chancellor and trusted friend Otto von Bismarck, 1858 to 1815 to 1898. For good or evil, modern Germany was largely the product of Germans' rising sense of nationalism and Bismarck's cunning, which means very intelligent, ability to use it to bring about the creation of a single, powerful national state, Germany. Like almost all 19th century patriots, Bismarck wished to see the German people united rather than remain fragmented among the 16 kingdoms and city-states left by the 1815 Treaty of Vienna. Above all, he wanted to complete what many years of Prussian policies had attempted to do, with only modest success, to unify all Germans under the political leadership of Berlin. The chief reasons for the failure thus far included lingering, which means something does not go away. Like pain, you can have a lingering pain. Here's the map, Prussia, right? And they're all going to put this together, and it's going to become modern Germany. Okay, you can see Austria down here, Bavaria. All right, so lingering suspicion, so a suspicion that doesn't go away. And bile is an acid burning liquid that comes from inside your gallbladder, between Northern Protestant and Southern Catholic. So these people, these groups of religious groups hated each other. Germans left over from earlier centuries of sectarian warfare and the determined opposition of Austria. So they didn't want Austria included. Bismarck's policy aimed at removing the Austrians from German affairs as soon as possible. Get these Austrians out of here. A lot of people think that Schwarzenegger is German, but he's actually from Austria, even though he speaks German. Again, people back and forth. To this end, Bismarck provoked Austria into declaring war on Prussia, so that Austria appeared to be the aggressor, again, tricking and making it possible to destroy people that maybe did not want to fight you. Austria appeared to be the aggressor in the eyes of other Germans who tried to remain neutral. So this fooled the people who were remaining neutral. The Prussians won the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, which was to be expected. They had more power. Unexpectedly, in one bloody battle. So only one battle. Instead of seeking territory or money damages, however, Bismarck insisted only that Austria withdrew from the German political affairs, leaving the field to Prussia to create a new confederation of Northern German states. So that is the end of the reading. Okay. And should I have a question? Yes, unfortunately I do. Sorry, this will be the last question of the day. So it shall be 11. They only give you 10s. I remember I threw one out. Maybe I can make this a 2Z. Okay, good. German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck wished to see what in Germany? So let me give you a few to answer that. The reading's done. This is our last question for the day. Wild. Okay, you got that? I'll get the eraser. Get you guys on your way. All right, repeating, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck wished to see what in Germany? So don't say, he wanted to see Yoshinoya, right? Or a couple of in and outs. That's what he wanted to see. They didn't have those things at this time, okay? That would be my funny guys. Okay, so that's out. Okay, go back. That's where we finished. Let me stop share. So goodbye, everybody. Take care. You've just finished Europe and the new states. And I shall see you next week. Okay, bye-bye.